I was thinking recently about what draws a reader into a novel. What can you put in the first scene or a chapter of a novel that will really make a reader want to continue with that story? There are a lot of different answers to that question, but the one thing I want to talk about today is offering the reader something unique. Something that signals to them that this novel is not like every other novel, something that's different, something that distinguishes your novel in some way from other novels. But that difference, that uniqueness that you offer the reader is more about instilling a specific feeling in the reader than it is necessarily about actually going in an original direction with the opening to your story. In fact, providing the reader something familiar is potentially equally as important. Your story needs to differentiate itself, but the way you do this is very subtle. This is not just about being off the wall or completely bending genre conventions or being super wacky and unexpected. This is a nuanced facet of an opening that gives the reader a sense of novelty. This is only part of what will draw a reader into the opening of a novel. I'm gonna level with you. The entire concept for this video is based off of like a 3-second emotional experience I had last week, so bear with me as I will potentially belabor this explanation. I was bored at work the other day, so I went on to one of the online critique websites where people post writing for review, and I ended up reading the first chapter of a romantic fantasy novel that someone had posted. I didn't critique it, but I did read it. The writing was actually pretty good. Good description, nice dialogue, decent prose flow. But as I was reading this first chapter, all I could think was, this feels exactly like every other romantic fantasy novel that I've ever read. Which I admit isn't that many. Romantasy is not my favorite concatenation of two genres, so I don't have a ton of experience with those books. But I could still feel in my bones that this novel was so squarely in the bounds of that genre as to be completely indiscernible from every other story in that genre. Nothing in the opening of the story allowed it to be distinguished, and that fact made it way harder to connect with that story. That fact had a massive detrimental effect on my enjoyment and my desire to continue reading that novel. There was nothing unique about the characters or the setting or the initial plot to make it feel like its own story. There was nothing that stood out. There was nothing that made the story its own story. Now, this writer did one thing very well. They made their story feel like a story of the genre they were writing in. But in doing so, they made it so that their story was completely blended into that genre and it got lost. That is the feeling that you want to avoid, and it is one of many things that your novel's opening must do. Any good opening of a novel needs to provide some kind of distinctive element that feels unique to that story, something to catch interest, while also having enough familiar elements to make readers of your genre feel comfortable. You want the reader to feel like this novel seems like all the other novels in the genre that I love, while also making them say, oh, that's interesting and unexpected, and I haven't seen that a million times, therefore I'm going to remember and be interested in reading the rest of this story. You need to satisfy the familiarity seeking parts of their brain and also the novelty seeking parts of their brain. Now, I want to drill into this idea of difference or unique or distinctiveness. Distinctive doesn't necessarily mean original. It doesn't have to be something that the reader has never seen before. An opening can have a distinctive element without necessarily stretching the bounds of the genre or straying into original territory. Your opening could be distinctive because the description is written so well. If in describing the face of your hero's lover, you bring the reader to tears, then you've distinguished the opening. An opening can be distinguished because the quality of the writing is just so good. An opening could be distinctive because there's a lot of something or a big emphasis on something. Maybe your novel opens with a character who's got a bag over their head so they can't see anything or smell anything, but they can hear people talking, so your opening passage is just a dialogue exchange that they're overhearing. This could also be something like a little plot twist that the reader wasn't expecting, or a little character quirk, like maybe your hero is this battle-hardened, gritty soldier and they're walking to battle, but they're also really into geology, so they stop to look at rocks along the way. It could also be an event that happens in the plot. Maybe the murder victim wakes up just as the detectives are unzipping the body bag or something like that. I'll give you some real-world novel examples of actual novels that do this. Herman Melville's apparently inappropriately named whale-themed novel has a very famous opening line where the character introduces themselves. That is very much a distinguishing feature of that novel's opening, and probably something that works to draw a lot of readers into it. 1984 is sort of a classic example of an opening that draws a lot of people in. I know not everybody thinks that. Some people don't really love the opening of 1984, but it's one that gets talked about, so it probably fits into this category. The Hobbit arguably has an opening that does this quite well, given the fact that it is basically like the prototypical fantasy novel. That's an example, perhaps, of an original opening which makes that novel distinctive. This is kind of a silly example, but it's a very personal example. But when I was first reading Best Served Cold, I found, for whatever reason, a lot of the character names to be very endearing. I don't know, they just felt very unique and well crafted, and that stood out to me when I was reading that novel. That's kind of a silly example, but it's a good example, I think, that illustrates the emotional sort of nature to this concept. It's not about having something that's super original or that the reader hasn't seen before. It's about having something that stands out and draws them in, something that is compelling and creates interest. Ultimately, you want your story to feel like it's differentiating itself. You want there to be a memorable selling point somewhere in the opening, something that the reader will remember, something that will enable them to separate this story from every other story. This also doesn't necessarily mean having something exciting in your opening, because a lot of novels start with big battles or gunfights or whatever. Excitement alone does not necessarily make an opening distinctive. A lot of novels open with excitement, but that excitement doesn't necessarily create distinctiveness. I also don't think that this distinguishing element needs to extend throughout the plot. Really, what you're trying to do here is foster an initial first impression of the story, which will make the reader interested in the rest of the story. This doesn't mean that the entire plot needs to be super distinctive. You can slip back into genre conventions if that's what you want to do. I think if you want to figure out if your novel has this thing and what that thing is, if it does have it, is to ask yourself what stands out in the opening of your novel. What is the reader likely to remember from your opening? And if all they remember from your opening is, well, this is just another romantasy, or this is another murder mystery, or this is another romance or whatever, then that's not a good sign. You want your novel to be the one with the character introducing themselves as first thing, or the clocks that have an extra number on them, or a bunch of short people meeting for a party. You want something distinctive that the reader will remember. This can be a very small thing. It could be one or two sentences. It could be a single moment within that opening scene. And what this could be is highly, highly variable. Speaking of distinctive things, the conclusion of this video is not going to be very distinctive because I really didn't write one. So there you have it. I'd love to hear what you think about this long rambling idea that I had and decided to make a video out of in the comments down below. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.